Alright, so we got the supercharger adapter plates installed. Getting ready to install the supercharger, and one thing that we need to do for doing that is removing the ECT sensor in your in your ICT billet adapter kit. You're going to get one of these screws here. You can see it's a very low profile head, and the purpose of this thing is because the intake throttle body, the body of the actual port on the supercharger has got this large, looks like a top of a pyramid. It's going to sit right on top of this. So I was hoping I could use maybe a 90-degree connector plug, a different ECT sensor that had a 90-degree, but it just still sits too high to clear it. So ultimately what I'm going to have to do is use this provided screw here to replace the ECT sensor, and utilize the kit that I got to relocate that sensor to the block. So the GM stuff. We're going to apply this to the screw that was provided from ICT. Going to be skipping one of the threads and applying a little bead to the remainder threads about 3/4 of the way up. And then since we're using, so this is an anaerobic sealant, so that means that it will set after 24 hours, and it will into a thermoset plastic to create the seal. Given that we have an aluminum water pump here, and this screw is also aluminum. It's pretty lightweight, so those are what you kind of consider an inactive metal. So to help out with the curing process, we're going to use some of this Loctite 7649. So this is a primer, so it deposits metal ions on the inactive metal, so that way the thermoset process will fill a cure with these. And normally, even with your thread lockers, those are also anaerobic sealants. You would want to use the 7649 for those situations too, where you have inactive materials or metals. You can use it even with active metals, so like your mild steel and copper and whatnot. It doesn't cause any issues. It actually would speed up the curing process. But for the most case, you'd use that for your inactive metals. So that's going to be like your aluminums, stainless steels, stuff like that. So let me get that set up, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so we got the coolant draining out of the engine. That way you can install this low profile screw. So I cleaned this guy off here. I'm just gonna open this up, and we're just gonna use a small amount. And it comes in different styles. There's the aerosol type, and then there's just the brush type. So I'm just gonna brush this on to the screw here. You can also use this with active metals. It helps quicken the curing process. So you can use it, if you're not sure, you can go ahead and just use it. It doesn't matter. It's compatible with inactive and active. Alright, we're going to give this about a minute to fully evaporate. It's kind of like when we're using brake clean. We want to make sure that it's fully evaporated. And according to the TDS, the technical data sheet, it cures within about 30 to 70 seconds. And then while we're waiting for that to fully evaporate, the Loctite 7649, I'm going to go ahead and knead some of this high performance thread sealant while it's in here. And then what we're going to do to apply this is we're going to skip the first thread and about cover 50 to 75% of the threads on this fastener. Now we've had time for this to fully evaporate. Let's go ahead and add some of this. You want to work this into the threads. It's a little bit thicker, it's got a little bit higher viscosity than your typical thread lockers do. So it's almost like a paste. So basically why we're doing this, why we're doing this is to prevent this from leaking. Alright, so that's what that looks like. So I'm trying to miss those first threads there. And I went ahead and cleaned the other threaded surface. Now I can just screw this guy in. I'm using a 19mm link here. So let me take you in to see what it looks like. So you can see that's about as fully seated onto the water pump as I can get. So now hopefully we got enough clearance to let the supercharger sit on there. Share something pretty important here that I haven't seen online, and I haven't seen that in any forums, YouTube videos. Haven't seen it on ICT Billets documentation. But I figured it'd be really nice to share to pass on the knowledge to somebody else so they can avoid wasting time when they're trying to install this supercharger. But here, so this would be on your passenger side. There is a dowel pin. It's not a hollow dowel pin like you normally see on the engine block when you pull off the heads. It's partway hollow, and then it's the bottom is solid, and that needs to come out. If you don't pull this out, then the supercharger won't be able to seat on the adapter plates. Now the holes on the adapter plates from ICT, where we put the screws, the cap screw fasteners to tighten that down on the cylinder heads, that hole is large enough to fit this dowel pin. But all these cap screw fasteners that we got from ICT, they're all the same length. So that dowel pin, it sticks out pretty tall. It will not be able to seat fully inside that hole because it bottoms out when it touches the cap screw. So one way that ICT could resolve that is they give you a shorter length cap screw to account for that. But since they didn't, the only other option we got is to remove this. And there's a couple ways you can remove it. So this is a very brittle dowel pin. So it's kind of like any other dowel pin. It's a locator dowel pin when you're setting this on. But it is very brittle. So one way you can do that to remove this is you can take a chisel and come at it perpendicular to it and give it a good hit, and it just cracks clean off. You don't have to worry about damaging anything else on the body or the hole. It'll crack clean off. You know, there's other ways that people take these just dowel pins in general. They remove them with vice grips. I don't think that would work unless you put maybe the back end of a drill bit inside there to keep the dowel pin from collapsing and cracking on you, because it is so brittle that I think that if you try to use vice grips and squeeze on it, it's just going to crack this thing up like a broken tooth, and you'd be pulling the pieces out. And then the other option is to actually use a dowel pin puller, and that's actually what I have. So I'll show you what I got. So this is actually from Goodson. They are pretty expensive. There are cheap ones out there, and on some other online resources like Amazon. I decided to go with something a little bit more name brand, just due to I don't want crap quality metals and worrying about things breaking. So I went and got this off Goodson. It comes in a metric, which is the one I have, and then it comes in the US customary sizes. But basically this is how it's set up. So you have, it basically is like a slide hammer. You have this removal basin. You use that only when you want to remove the collet. You have a gripping collet, which is this guy. Then you have a tightening sleeve, and then the actual slide hammer part, and then it comes with this very long screw here that the slide hammer slides up on. And basically the way this works, so this is a 10 millimeter outside diameter dowel pin. So you get the right size collet for your dowel pin. You put that over top of it, and then you're going to use your tightening sleeve to it's going to slide over top of this, and then you use the hammer, the slide hammer. You give that a couple hard hit slides down, and that will friction press the your tightening sleeve onto your collet. So that will then provide the grip on your dowel pin, and then it's pretty simple from there. Once you have that set up, you just strike up on the slide hammer, and then hopefully it just pops right out. So that's what I did on mine. And one thing to note is that the dowel is very smooth. It's a highly polished finish on the dowel pin. And so what might happen is, because the inside of this collet is smooth, it's got a smooth bore as well, and then you only have a friction fit. The grip is only as tight as you can get the tightening sleeve down on here, which is only as hard as you can hammer down. And you don't want to hammer down too hard, because you don't want this to strike your intake surface here and damage that. So you might run into issues where you go to slide and the grip, it doesn't grip well enough and slips off because of the polished surface. And I got this from Goodson, but there's a tip that Goodson has, but they call it a machinist hack. And basically, there's kind of two ways you can do this. You want to roughen up the surface on the dowel pin, and so one way you can do that is with some sandpaper. Another way you can do that is with like a emery cloth or Scotch-Brite pad. But if you have a lapping compound, if you lap your valves, you're gonna have some lapping compound. This is 200 grit. But basically, what you can do with this is so basically this is just a kind of a medium viscous type base fluid that has compound in there for a grit grip type material, and you can put a little bit on the perimeter of your dowel pin, and then when you slide this guy down on there and tighten it, that's going to provide you a grip between this surface and the surface of your dowel pin. But it should give you enough grip with this 200 grit valve popping compound, so when you go to pop it out, it'll come out with it. So anyways, that's a pretty important tip I wanted to share, because I did notice that when I was getting ready to install it, wasn't sure how that was going to come together, and then after getting the supercharger kind of roughed in there and seeing that it wasn't seating properly, I noticed it was because it was hitting on that dowel pin. So you definitely want to remove that. Alright guys, so we got the supercharger on the adapters. It was a little bit of a chore to do. Let's see, some key points here. So what I did was I went ahead and installed my, before installing the supercharger, I went ahead and installed my adapter here. As you can see, it's a pretty tight fit back there to try to install this connector on that map sensor, the T-map sensor, once you have the supercharger on the truck. So I did that ahead of time. The other thing I did before installing the supercharger on the truck was to get my PCV system set up. So this is our tubing that's going to go to the clean side of the catch can. So luckily when I bought the Mighty Mouse catch can, it came with a lot of the pretty long length of Parker tubing here, and I kept that. I'm glad I kept it. So I went ahead and installed it on our barb fitting we put on here, and then I left this long so I can trim it down to size, and then take the A and N fitting off the old one and use it for the new one. So yeah, that's a couple things to keep in mind. You know, installing your T-map connector before you install the supercharger. Take care of your PCV if you're doing it with this route. The other thing I needed, some other tips. There's this main harness here. Might be hard to see, but it sits in this tray, and this is held down by 3 zip ties and some black tape. So it's pretty tight in that corner back there. So what I did was I went ahead and to allow this to move as the supercharger is pushed back into the back, I went ahead and snipped off the zip ties and the black tape and pulled it out of its tray so it has room to move as I push the supercharger in. Otherwise this will be fixed and you can't get the supercharger seat on the adapters. So we'll clean this back up with zip ties later on. But the other big one that makes this a tight fit is my heater lines. So the heater core lines over there. I had to bend those just a little bit. It's not enough to cause any breakage, but I basically bent them up a little bit and then kind of off to my left, so that way you can clear the cap or the lid screws there. So that's something to really watch out for, because you want to make sure you got plenty of clearance in there, because you don't want that to cause any damage. I'm going to try to slide the sleeve up more towards the back, because, you know, as the engine vibrates, it's going to over time probably wear out that tubing. So I'm gonna do that. But yeah, other than that, it wasn't too bad. Kind of slid right in place. See, I just need to watch out for your connectors down here. Make sure you have everything out of the way. And then I got to go fish out my connector in here for the evap purge solenoid. Went ahead and got that installed. My pipe here will reach, luckily, so we'll connect that once we're finished, and then hook up the connector. So for right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull off the lid. I just secured this down with 2 of the lid screws, because I didn't want any debris to fall into the supercharger while I was trying to install it. So I just fastened them down with 2 of them. So we're going to remove that, pull off the lid, and then start prepping our base bolts to bolt it down to the adapter plates. Alright, so we got the base bolts here. We're going to get prepped for the supercharger. So just like what we did for our ECT plug, I'm going to, so this is either a galvanized or some sort of stainless fastener. It's going to be going into an aluminum adapter, the ICT adapters. So I want to secure those down with blue thread locker. And in this case it's Permatex. You could use the Loctite 243, but I want to make sure those fasteners, once I torque them down, are going to stay in place. So to do that, as we talked about before, since this is going to be an inactive metal, I want to use my Loctite 7649 to make sure that this is going to cure properly and set. So just like I did before, I'm just gonna get all these vase bolts and brush on our Loctite 7649, let it evaporate, and then once we do that, I'll apply the Loctite or the thread locker. So we got our fasteners here for the supercharger base all prepped. So we got the 7649 on each one of these. Had some time to dry, and now that that's dried, I went ahead and put our blue thread locker on there. So now I'm going to get ready to fasten these down onto the actual supercharger. Alright guys, what I'm going to show is those 4 back bolts, or those 4 back screws. Those are very difficult to put in after you got the supercharger on the adapter plates. So what I ended up doing was, for these 2 over here on the passenger side, using a zip tie to keep them held up. And then for the other 2, I'm doing the same thing, just using zip ties to keep them held up. Another tip for you. So we ran into an issue with installing the supercharger, and it has to do actually with it's a minor issue really, but it has to do with the blockage here for the engine coolant temperature sensor. So the kit that ICT built is a very low profile hex type socket, and that actually is causing some issues. And let me see if I can get you guys in on here. Get the light out. So if you can see that, basically it does not sit flush enough. So I have that as tight as I can get it, and I don't want to go much tighter or risk damaging the threads, either in the aluminum water pump or the threads on that screw. But basically what's happening is the throttle body part of the body of the supercharger, it's resting right on top of this head and is not allowing the supercharger to sit totally flush on the adapter plates. And you can kind of see that right here. So you can, if you guys can, hopefully can see that on the camera. But basically, let's see if I can. So you can see a little bit of the gasket material that's on the intake ports. You can see that there's a small gap there, and I haven't torqued these down yet, and I don't want to because I don't want to risk damaging or stretching the base bolts of the supercharger. But the rear ones, they sit flush. It's really just these on both sides. Actually, really on this side, the driver's side, the first 2 intake ports there, and it all has to do with the body of the supercharger on the throttle, mainly on the throttle port here, with that touching the head of that block-off plug. So that's definitely going to be an issue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the supercharger back off, and I actually went and purchased a pipe plug. So this has got the recessed counter-driven hex head in here, and we're going to replace the ICT, so we're going to replace the plug that came with the ICT billet adapter kit with this guy. This was actually pretty difficult to come by. You know, none of the hardware stores really carried these. Even some of the mom and pop hardware stores that are around here. So one thing to keep in mind here, that just like everything else with GM these days, this is metric, so these are not MPT or NPS. So this is not a national pipeline type thread. It's actually an ISO or metric thread. This is the M12 by 1.5, and so a lot of the hardware stores with pipe plugs, they carry the traditional NP style, the national pipeline or national pipe threads, whether that's the taper or the straight. So I basically got these offline from Dorman. Even some of the auto parts stores, it looked like they used to carry these Dorman pipe plugs, but they just stopped doing it. So the ones I got here, this is see the part number there. But yeah, this is just M12 by 1.5, 10 millimeter length pipe plug. So the goal of this guy is it'll be able to sit flush with the water pump. So that with essentially that supercharger will be sitting right on top of the water pump, and then hopefully that'll eliminate that small gap so it doesn't cause any leaks. So you might be asking, you know, how did I get that size? One way to get to do that is you can just pull off the ECT sensor and measure that yourself with some thread pitch gauges. Another way you can validate that is on ICT Billet's website. When you go and purchase the relocation adapter, it'll specify what this is. So this is an M28 because it's going to go into the block plug you're going to replace. And then this here is the M12 1.5 threads for the ECT sensor. So that's another way you can validate that. And as you can see here, it screws in like it should. And I'm not going to screw it all the way in because it's got the pipe sealant on here. But it fits in there just perfect. So I know this will fit in our water pump here. So anyways, that's just kind of a gotcha, I guess, to watch out for. Yeah, maybe that's not going to be a problem with other applications, but just keep in mind if you're going to do this, maybe already have some of these on hand, because I had to wait 3 days to get this stupid thing, which just means it's 3 days less that I have work progress on this project. So anyways, yeah, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and pull the supercharger back off here and then replace that ICT billet plug with this guy. So we'll get to that now. Alright, so I got the supercharger off. I'm getting ready to pull out that plug. Just a 19 millimeter socket. So that's what we got on there now. That's pretty much flush with our water pump body. I don't want to, it's getting pretty tight. I don't want to go too deep and run into stripping threads or messing things up. But hopefully that will work. It's definitely a lot, the profile is a lot lower than the ICT billet one. Again, no torque specs I'm going after. My goal is to run this down until it can set flush with that. And that is a 10 millimeter depth, so I guess the other concern is making sure that it's not going to block any fluid. But I think we'll be okay. So now I'm going to get the supercharger back on there and see if that helped us out at all. I'm pretty sure it did, but we'll see. So back here, there was that connector piece that goes on to the stock intake manifold, and I'm obviously not planning on reusing that, so I went ahead and trimmed those off with a pair of side cutters, the Christmas tree pieces. That way it doesn't interfere with this tail part of the supercharger and not make it easier to push the supercharger fully back. And also, I was talking about this sleeve here. Remember, I had to move this heater core line a little bit, and it still does touch the body of the supercharger and the lid. And they from the factory, GM already has this nylon protection sleeve. It was slid down to this connector over here, so I went ahead and slid it all the way back as far as I could, just to give it some protection. You know, over the years, it's going to be subject to a lot of vibration, and that's going to eventually start wearing against the supercharger. So instead of having bare aluminum to aluminum and wearing things out at a fast rate, hopefully this nylon sleeve will prevent some of that. So I'm going to grab some electrical tape, clean up this hose a little bit, and just tape it off here so it doesn't shift while it's in service. And then once I do that, we'll get the superchargers installed again. Alright guys, so I got the supercharger on, and definitely replacing this block off plug that I got from ICT with actual pipe plug was the fix. So you can see now that the sealing is definitely better. You don't see any intake manifold gaskets, and I haven't even torqued it down yet. So that's awesome. I'm glad that was an easy fix. So now, like I said, I got all the bolts just kind of hand tightened, and I'm going to get ready to torque them down. So I got my torque pattern here with the specifications. It's just like everything else so far in the supercharger. 89 inch-pounds. Again, keyword there is inch-pounds, not foot-pounds. So I'm going to go through the procedure here of torquing these down. So it's pretty basic. You start off with third bolt here, and then go to its adjacent, and then go back and forth, and then eventually work your way up to the front. So kind of like just any other cross pattern for torquing down. And then you can see I also went ahead and taped up that sleeve on our heater hose to make sure it doesn't slide down over time. So hopefully that will protect the hose and the supercharger from abnormal wear. I mean, I imagine it's going to wear a little bit, but hopefully that will reduce the amount of wear. So go ahead and torque these down, and we'll go from there. Alright, perfect. Got everything torqued down to 89 inch-pounds. And man, it feels good to finally get that installed, get the supercharger installed. Before I torque down the base bolts on the supercharger, I did, since I had to remove it, I went ahead and replaced or added thread lock to those again, so I don't have to worry about vibration and any of that fun stuff, loosening these up, loosening the base bolts up or base screws up over time. So yeah, that actually wasn't too bad. If it wasn't for a couple of those, it took me so long because of a couple of those caveats that I came across, or a little bit of issues. But we'll recap those once we finish up here. So the last thing we got going on, the last thing we got for the supercharger install, you know, and what I mean by that is literally just installing the supercharger itself on those adapter plates, is the lid. So I'm going to go ahead and get the low profile lid over here, and then we'll start torquing those down as well. This one's going to be another challenge, mainly these rear screws back here. So you can see it'd be perfect if this part of the lid didn't angle up. So that's definitely going to make it a challenge. Fortunately, there still is a little, I mean, probably about my index finger's worth of clearance to get something back there. So what I'm going to attempt to do is utilize these plastic washers that are already in there. They provide enough friction to hold the screws in place. So what I did was I just placed them in there until they're flush with the bottom. So I got these 4 in here installed, and then I'm gonna gently lay the lid down on the supercharger, and then begin by hand tightening these ones up here and that I can get access to, and leave these ones for the last to hand tighten. The other thing I needed to do to help with clearance, not really for the lid but for my hand, was I removed one of these Christmas tree connectors right there. You can see that comes off on this connector, so it actually pops off pretty easy. It attaches up there on the bulkhead. So I just pulled that down so that way I can get it out of the way, so to make it easier to access by hand. I think I'm going to go ahead and throw, just looking at that, it looks pretty tight too. Go ahead and throw this one in here. So I just got one finger on the bottom there to keep this thing from going too deep. And that's how I did it to all these screws. So got these prepped. Actually, take that back. What we're going to need to do first, almost forgot. I'm going to throw some Loctite on here. So same process before. This appears to be, I don't think it's a stainless. It's got some sort of a coating on it. Or it could be just pure steel, I'm not sure. But the supercharger body there itself is aluminum. So like we done in the other video, in the other fasteners, I'm going to put the Loctite 7649 on there, that primer, to get some metal ions onto the threads. So that way when we apply the Loctite, it will cure properly. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, get all these things primed with that Loctite 7649 that's in the egg carton over there. Get our Loctite on there, and then put these back on, and then start to get the lid on there. So this would be dead simple if it wasn't for these 5 fasteners in the back there, but we'll work through it. Alright, so I got all my screws here for the cover, prepped with the primed with the 7649, Loctite 7649. Let that evaporate, and then went ahead and applied our blue medium strength thread locker. So now I'm going to go ahead and put those fasteners back here again like I had before, and then once I do that, we'll start getting this cover onto the supercharger. All the of all the fasteners for the cover hand tightened except for the ones in the rear. So I'm gonna try to attack those ones next. Might take some noodling to figure out how we're gonna get to those ones. Alright guys, so we're ready to torque down the cover bolts here. So here is our torque pattern. So this is the front, this is the back, this would be the passenger side, driver side. So got a situation like I was talking about before with this back part of the cover coming up. I can't access these back here with the torque wrench. There's just not any room. In fact, all I can really do is hand tighten these ones in the very back. It is possible to get back there. It's just you have to literally lay yourself, your whole body on top of the supercharger and then reach your arm all the way up to the elbow back in this area. And then using like a hand wrench or even a really short stubby ratchet, you can get back there and tighten those. So those ones I'm going to have to leave hand tightened. But I can definitely get, and same with this one here, which you can see over there, it's pretty tight to get a torque wrench in there. About the best you can get is a hand wrench. That one will also leave hand tightened, but the rest of these I can access with the torque wrench. So the bolt pattern is pretty simple. You're basically going from side to side and then back to front. So we're going to have to modify my torque pattern a little bit, given that I can't access some of these with the torque wrench. So yeah, we'll go ahead and get started on that, and then we'll be ready to kind of wrap this up as far as the actual install of the supercharger. Alright, so just like how everything else has been on the supercharger, we're going to torque this down to 89 inch-pounds. Again, keyword there is inches, not foot. So we'll set this up. Okay, so my inch-pound torque wrench set up. Let's go ahead and start torquing those down. Okay, so now that we got the supercharger installed, we got the cover installed, everything torqued down to specs. Let's just kind of do a recap over this process, give you guys kind of a summary of overall how it went for me, and give you some of those summary of those tips that would hopefully make it go a lot smoother for you. So let's kind of start back at the beginning with the adapter plates. Adapter plates were perfect. Those things, they lined up well. Had no issues really getting those installed. Trying to think back here. The only caveat, the only thing to watch out for was they are symmetrical in terms of the pattern, but the two closest bolt hole patterns that are on, depending on what you call the front and the back, are reversed. So you have to watch out for that. So way in the back there's two fasteners that are close together. So you want to make sure that the adapter is oriented correctly for those, and it's the opposite for the one in the front. That was one thing I wasn't really expecting. You know, I noted that there was the two out of the base bolt patterns. There were two that were closer together. I just didn't really realize that they both couldn't face the same orientation. They had to be one was in reverse. Didn't really come apparent to me until I was getting ready to put the supercharger on, and noticed that. So that's one thing to watch out for the adapters. Let's see, the foam pad, so that's a sound detonation pad. You don't have to take that out if you don't want to. I left mine in there. It's not really going to cause any issues. So that's just a choice you can make. Let's see what else. So I guess going to the supercharger itself, if you guys remember, there was that dowel pin on one side of the supercharger. I believe it was the passenger side. And because ICT doesn't give you a shorter length fastener, you'll have to remove that dowel pin. Otherwise it will bottom out on the cap screw, and then it won't seal properly. So we kind of already talked about previously in the video some different ways you can remove that dowel pin, but you definitely need to account for that and remove it. That way it sits flush. Okay, so that's the adapter plates, the dowel pins. So starting to go into the supercharger. Some things about that, as I mentioned, that Christmas tree pack that's back there that secured itself to the stock intake manifold. I clipped off those Christmas tree pieces. That did help quite a bit because they were, at least one of them was causing some interference with the cable there. You don't have to take them off, it just made them easier for me. So that's one thing. Let's see, this vent hose here, you got to watch out for this guy. He kind of gets in the way. The supercharger will actually kind of wrap itself around it and want to take it with it. And it's a pretty flexible hose, so it can pinch itself in there. So if you're not getting the supercharger to seat properly on the adapter plates, make sure this guy isn't wrapped up underneath it. See, one other thing is when you're installing the supercharger, I already had my PCV here. If you're not using the LT4 Loma, the lifter oil manifold assembly, if you can use the L83, L86 one, and you're gonna route your PCV differently system, go ahead and get that set up before you install the supercharger, because there's basically very limited access to get. You don't want to do when this thing's already on. It's pretty difficult. Let's see what else do we have about the rear fasteners back there, the base fasteners. One trick that I did was the two on the passenger side, I zip tied those together using just a big loop, keeping them high enough where they can clear and not scratch up your adapter plates when you're installing the supercharger. Kind of same thing back here on the rear driver side. I put in one of the cover fasteners into the base of the supercharger and then fastened the rear base screw to that. And then once I had the supercharger installed, I just snipped the zip tie and let them fall into place. And then another big thing to watch out for is the engine coolant temperature sensor. You guys can try the ICT block off that came when you purchase the ICT adapters, the tall adapters. You can try that, see if it works for you. It didn't for me. I had to remove that and actually replace it with a pipe plug, an N12 by 1.5 millimeter pipe plug. And just keep in mind that is a metric thread. That's not national pipe threads. So don't try to put an MPT or MPS in there. They might start to screw together, but you could damage threads or cause leaks. So I'd say the biggest ones that caused a little bit of complications was the pipe plug for blocking off the engine coolant temperature sensor, the dowel pin, the alignment dowel pin on the supercharger. Those were probably the two big ones that just frustrated the heck out of me. Once I understood what was going on, it was simple to fix. It was just took time to get parts and all that stuff, so it kind of knocked me out of the zone. Let's see, what else do we do as a summary? Another thing is also, before you install the supercharger, is go ahead and get your map installed on the back, and go ahead and connect your wire extension and get that already set up, so when you install it, it's easy to just move it out of the way and route it however you want. But trying to fasten that connector while this thing's already installed, there's not much room back there, so it's going to be a bear if you try to do that with it already installed, the supercharger already installed. Let's see, so I think the case here of the adapters takes care of the actual supercharger. Torquing those things down, the base fasteners was easy. Had full access to all the fasteners. The only other thing left that was a little bit of a challenge was this cover, and only being the rear fasteners, and that's mainly because of that piece on the cover there that starts to lift up. That makes accessing those fasteners from the top pretty much impossible. You'll have to reach it over here in this back here. So I had to lay on top of the supercharger and then bury my arm up to the elbow back there in the bulkhead. And I couldn't get a torque wrench back there. I had to hand tighten those. Luckily, these fasteners, they don't require a lot of torque, so hand tightening should suffice. So other than that, it was pretty straightforward, pretty simple. Everything went together pretty well. Oh, actually, I'd say the largest, I forgot one thing, gotcha. That was a challenge. And again, this hopefully you guys won't have the same complications and take as much time as I did. This is a learning process for me. But the other big one, outside of the dowel pin and outside of the water, the engine coolant temperature sensor block off plug, the other big one that was just ended up kept on being a recurrent frustration point is that water heater hose. The input, the one on the far right there. So that is aluminum, so you can bend it. Just be very gentle when you bend those, because if you put too much shock to them, it'll potentially crack them, or if you bend them too much and the aluminum starts to go into plastic deformation, it'll end up splitting or cracking the pipe. But I did have to actually bend the in and the out a little bit away from the supercharger. The out not so much, but the in, I had to bend that one up and out, so that way the supercharger could fit back there, and also the cover. It was actually a bigger issue for the cover, because there's these corners that extend past the base of the supercharger, and it kept on bumping into that heater core hose. It wouldn't allow the fasteners to line up in the holes. So yeah, just bending those out a little bit. You don't have to bend a lot. I mean, it was maybe less than an inch in both directions, and that made it sit in really smooth. But pretty happy with how it went as far as the install goes. Everything made it up nicely. Looks like I still got pretty good clearance. But yeah, hopefully if you guys decide to do this on your own, those tips there will help you out, because it's definitely a pain in the arse if you don't do that ahead of time. So what we're going to do next is, now that we've got that, the big part of that accomplished, you know, getting the supercharger on the engine. What we're going to tackle next is our idler brackets for the new belt. So we'll get the idler bracket on there, and then I guess we can do the throttle body, putting the adapter and then the new LT4 throttle body on there. And then the only thing that should be left is the cooling system. So then we'll do that one next. We'll get the heat exchanger mounted in the front. And then the pump and all that stuff, the filler neck. And then I think the last thing after that will be just the electrical connections, you know, getting all the extensions and plugged in and all that. Oh yeah, actually I still need to relocate the engine coolant temperature sensor. So we'll probably do that. Either we'll do that pretty shortly in one of the videos. We'll definitely cover it. But yeah, hopefully that this helps out anybody out there that's trying to install this LT4 early model 2015-16 supercharger on their L83, even L86. I think so far I'm really happy. I can't wait to, pretty excited, and can't wait to get this thing all together and get this thing fired up and start getting into the tuning process. So, alright guys, catch you on the next video.